Let's talk about how the 80s crack era is still affecting my family in 2023. So my grandparents came from the projects in LA, very, very, very poor, and they fell in love in a hopeless place. They ended up having 3 children. So one is my mother, and then my aunt, and then their older brother. So they ended up having 3 children together. And eventually, my grandfather became very abusive. He then beat my grandmother, created scars that were black and blue on her face. He knocked her 2 front teeth out. My grandmother then got with this man, this Muslim man, and then had my other uncle. With this man had got my grandmother on drugs, raped my mom. He was just crazy. Constantly was a sexual assaulter and a drug abuser. So he got my grandmother addicted to drugs. They did drugs together. And ultimately, my grandmother then lost custody of her children, and they were put in the foster care system and to go live with aunts and uncles and all that. Now, through the foster care system, now these 4 children, my mom was around 7, and, all of them were around that younger age. They are now being neglected, abused, sexually assaulted more, and just overall treated like shit. My mom said that they didn't even have underwear sometimes. And my grandmother never got custody of her kids ever again. So my mom was taken away at 7 years old, and she never lived with any of her parents ever again. My grandfather was also on drugs, very, very terribly bad, but he never had custody. Fast forward, and these adults are now having children, which are my cousins, which are me, which is our generation. And my mom is the only one that actually raised both of her kids. Her other 3 siblings then followed the same toxic generational curses of child abandonment, neglect, sexual assault, abuse. A lot of Black people, especially, in our community, they do not think that therapy is something that's important. However, my mom just made sure that she equipped herself with therapy. So we are still being affected by the 80s crack era to this day, because a lot of adults have chosen not to heal their childhood trauma and their childhood wounds. And I'm not saying that what they were going through wasn't, very, very absolutely terrible. But if you do not heal from your childhood, if you do not heal from your trauma, you just end up passing it down to the next generation. And if nobody chooses to break the cycle, then there's just going to be a lineage of trauma and damage upon the whole family. And that's how we're still being affected today.